I'm Cai. So I'm based at GS as well, working with Torsten. And my research is on the patterns and processes of change in coastal ecosystems. So I focus on salt marshes and mangrove forests in particular. And so why these systems? They're particularly valuable to society. So they act as hubs for biodiversity. We use them for resources like flood protection, the extraction of resources like food and wood. And they're also globally recognized as valuable ecosystems to absorb carbon and trap it beneath the ground. Sadly, though, these environments are really under threat because of development and rising sea levels. They're being sort of squashed at the coast. And that's resulted, particularly over the last decade, in a huge amount of loss of these really valuable and precious environments. And so the work I'm doing is all about trying to understand how they're changing and what the consequences of that change might be for people. And so I do that in a number of ways. To understand the patterns of change, I've been using things like maps and aerial photographs and satellite images to document the change in marsh extent over time. And that's one of the maps here. You can see then for the Dovey Estuary on the top, how change is distributed in a particular environment. Areas that are very stable, areas that are dynamic. And so when we have good information on how these environments change, it's then important to understand what might be the drivers behind that change. And so for my current postdoc, alongside Torsten, we've been developing this sensor here. We call it the Mini Boy. It's a sort of a homemade sensor that will give us information on currents, waves, and inundation, which are your sort of main agents of change in these environments. And when we plot those out in these sorts of 3D plots, and compare areas that are eroding versus areas that are expanding, we can identify somewhere in this three-dimensional plot there'll be a threshold. And so we can start to predict when an area is going to erode, when it will expand. So with some really good understanding of how the environment changes, it's then important to also look at the value of these environments. And so particularly for my last postdoc, I did a lot of work on blue carbon, and that is the organic carbon that's trapped in these coastal environments. So alongside teams of citizen scientists, we collected soil cores for marshes right the way across Britain. And then using a combination of machine learning and remote sensing, we can then predict how much carbon is distributed in an entire salt marsh. And that's what the map here shows. And you can then see how parts of the marsh on the top in that dark red color is very carbon dense. Producing these is really important for carbon accounting, identifying areas that are important and then hence need to be protected from development and such like. And then to sort of complete that circle, it's important to include the human element, how people are using the salt marsh mangrove resource. Something that I work a little bit less on, but in my current project, we're collaborating with researchers in Vietnam, using participatory mapping and getting local communities to map out how they're using these resources. And then you can combine that, linking the value and the vulnerability of these systems together in one. So in terms of my sort of future vision then, I plan to so I plan to sort of take everything that I've learned and apply it to a fellowship application. So I've worked in the tropics, I've worked in temperate regions, and now I want to work in the Arctic. So I've got, there's a number of sites. Well, the Arctic is one of the fastest warming places in the world, and that's going to have a huge consequence on coastal environments right the way across the circumpolar Arctic coast, including coastal wetlands, of which there are many distributed along that, across the pole. And so I've got a number of sites I'd like to work at, 6 in total across the Arctic, but focusing primarily on Hudson Bay. And what we have in Hudson Bay is quite intriguing. There's a continuous stretch of marsh going right the way from the north to the south, which crosses a sort of temperature gradient. So it's almost a natural laboratory where as you move further down, the environment is warming. And so that will sort of simulate the effects of climate change. And so what I want to sort of look at is how along that gradient does the geomorphology of the marshes change, the geomorphology, the relationship between expansion and erosion, which might be driven by changes in temperature. And so I plan to use things like remote sensing to document that. but also use traditional knowledge systems to paint a picture of how these environments are changing. These Arctic regions aren't wild, empty wildernesses. They're homes to indigenous cultures who are sentinels of how the environments here are changing. So by coupling science and traditional knowledge, I should hopefully be able to paint some really detailed image of how the environment there is changing, but then also link that to what we're potentially losing, the value of these environments. And so I'm going to focus on carbon. And so, for example, we might see that, as the temperatures rise, plants increase their productivity and might actually trap more carbon. But that means nothing if the environment is eroding because of a loss in permafrost. That ground becomes much more vulnerable to erosion. And so I'm keen to meet with researchers who've worked in these sorts of environments. It's something a little bit new. I think that's the big challenge of a project like this, actually working in the Arctic, but also I'd like to talk to researchers who've worked with Indigenous communities, co-produced research alongside them, something that I'm keen to include in my application.